He walked into the diner like he owned the deed to it. Not the building, not the booth, the whole room. The way his shoulders filled the doorway, the way his boots hit the linoleum, each step a little louder than the last. You got the sense he'd been practicing that walk for years, maybe his whole life. His name was Brandon Kyle Sutter, 26 years old, a corporal with the 75th Ranger Regiment, home on leave for 12 days, and somewhere between the airport and his mother's house. He had decided that Millhaven, Georgia was too small and too quiet and too full of people who didn't know what he knew. He slid into the booth nearest the window, the one with the best sightline to the rest of the room, and he ordered black coffee before the waitress had even finished saying good morning. He said it like he was giving a command. Not rude exactly, just certain. Certain in the way that men get when they've spent enough time being the loudest voice in every room they walk into. There were 7 other people in that diner on a Tuesday morning in early October. A mother with a toddler in a high chair, 2 county workers in orange vests eating eggs, a teenage girl doing homework at the counter, a man in a plaid jacket reading a newspaper, and in the far corner, back against the wall, facing the door, because that's the only way a man like that ever sits, was an old man that nobody paid much attention to. He came in every Tuesday and Thursday, had for years from what the regulars said. He always ordered the same thing, oatmeal, no brown sugar, a side of dry wheat toast, and a small orange juice. He always sat in that corner. He always brought something to read, though he rarely seemed to be reading it. He tipped exactly 20%, calculated to the cent, and he never lingered after he finished eating. He just paid, put on his jacket, and left the same way he came in, quietly, without a fuss. His name, if you'd thought to ask anyone, was Wallace Gidney. He was 74 years old. He had a slight tremor in his left hand that appeared whenever he was holding something still, a cup of coffee, a fork, but disappeared entirely when he was in motion. His eyes were pale grey and very steady, the kind of eyes that made you feel like whatever you said next was going to be weighed against something heavy you couldn't see. Brandon Kyle Sutter hadn't noticed him yet. He was busy noticing himself. The coffee arrived. He wrapped both hands around the mug and exhaled like a man who had just survived something, which he had, technically. 14 months in and out of forward operating bases that most people in this diner couldn't have found on a map. That was the part that sat wrong with him in ways he hadn't found words for yet, that he could come back here, sit in this diner, order this coffee, and nobody would know, nobody would ask, nobody would look at him differently. The county workers talked about a pothole on Route 9. The mother was negotiating a spoonful of oatmeal with the toddler. The teenage girl chewed her pencil and stared at a geometry problem. Brandon cleared his throat, not because he needed to, he just needed to hear something. He started talking to the waitress when she came to refill his cup. She was maybe 20, with the particular patience of someone who had learned it young. "You from here originally?" he asked. "Born and raised," she said. "Millhaven born and raised," he repeated, like he was considering the weight of it. "I bet you've never been more than 50 miles from this town." She gave him a polite smile that meant she'd heard something like this before and had developed a system for dealing with it. "Can I get you anything else?" "No, I'm good." He turned back to the window. Then almost to himself, loud enough to carry, 14 months overseas and the most exciting thing people here want to talk about is potholes. The county workers looked up briefly. The man in the plaid jacket turned a page of his newspaper. Brandon leaned back in the booth and stretched both arms overhead. A slow, deliberate motion, and then he started talking again. Not to anyone in particular, to the room. He had learned, somewhere along the way, that if you spoke at the right volume in a small enough space, the room became your audience whether it wanted to be or not. He talked about a night operation outside a city he named, with the ease of someone reciting a grocery list. He talked about a particular entry method that his unit had used to clear a building in under 40 seconds. He talked about the kind of focus it took, the particular mental calibration, the things a civilian brain simply could not access because it had never been required to. He wasn't bragging exactly, he was explaining. The distinction in his mind was important. Most people have no idea, he said, to no one and everyone. They see a uniform and they say thank you for your service and they think that covers it. But what we do, what some of us do, it's a different level. There's a reason not everyone gets to that level. He paused, let that sit. Rangers, special operations, there's a code to it. A whole way of thinking that takes years to develop, and most people never get there because most people never have to. The man in the plaid jacket lowered his newspaper, just slightly, just enough that he could see over the top of it without appearing to look. Wallace Gidney was watching Brandon Kyle Sutter with the same expression he'd had since the young man walked in. Not irritation, not amusement, something quieter than either, something more like recognition. He folded his newspaper carefully and set it on the table. He picked up his orange juice, took a sip, and set it down with the same deliberateness. Then he went back to looking out the window. Brandon had been talking for almost 10 minutes when he finally noticed the old man in the corner. He noticed him the way you notice a piece of furniture that's been in a room so long it starts to feel like part of the wall. A sudden awareness, like your eyes adjusting. He noticed the stillness of him, the way he held himself, the particular quality of the silence that surrounded his corner of the room. "Hey," Brandon said, not loudly, almost casually. The old man looked over. "No offense, but you've been sitting there the whole time and you haven't said a word." Brandon gave a half smile. "You a veteran?" Wallace Gidney looked at him for a moment. "What makes you ask?" "The way you sit," Brandon said. And he meant it. There was something in the old man's posture that was neither tense nor relaxed, but alert in the way that people get when alertness has been required of them for so long it stops being a choice. "Back to the wall. Door in your sightline. That's not a civilian habit." "Observant," the old man said. "We train for it." Brandon nodded, pleased with this. "So what branch?" "Army," Wallace Gidney said. "Yeah? What years?" "A few." Brandon waited for more. More didn't come. "What unit?" he asked. The old man picked up his orange juice again. "You ask a lot of questions." "I'm just making conversation." Brandon spread his hands. "I was talking about what we do, our unit, the kind of training that separates Rangers from." "I heard," Wallace said. Something about the way he said it made Brandon pause. Not the words, the tone. It was the tone of a man who had been in rooms where people said a great deal about a great many things and had long since learned to hear the difference between saying and knowing. "You got a problem with something I said?" Brandon asked. "Did I say I had a problem?" "You've got a look," son Wallace Gidney said, and his voice was the quiet that comes after weather. "I've had this face for 74 years. Don't go reading into it." Brandon laughed. A short sound, not quite genuine. He looked around the diner as if recruiting witnesses. The county workers had gone back to their eggs. The waitress was refilling salt shakers at the counter. "All right," Brandon said. "All right, fair enough." He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "But I'm curious now. You were Army. What did you do? Infantry? Supply?" "This and that," the old man said. "This and that." Brandon repeated it slowly, in the voice people use when they're deciding whether to be amused or insulted. "See, that's what most guys say when they were support roles. Motor pool, mess hall, admin. Nothing wrong with it," he added quickly, magnanimously. "Somebody's got to do it. But when you've been in a specialized unit, when you've gone through selection, when you've done the kind of work we do, you don't say this and that. You know exactly what you did. It's specific." Wallace Gidney let the words settle over the table like dust after a long drive. He didn't respond right away. He looked down at his oatmeal. He took a spoonful, chewed it and swallowed. He unfolded the paper napkin in his lap and patted his mouth. Then he said, "What's your name, son?" "Sutter, Brandon Kyle Sutter. Corporal, 75th Ranger Regiment. How long have you been in, Corporal Sutter?" 4 years. Wallace nodded, the way a man nods at a fact he already knew. 4 years, he said. "And in those 4 years, you've learned that there are men who are specific and men who are not. Men who can name what they did and men who can't." He paused. "Is that the measure?" "It's part of it," Brandon said. He felt something shifting in the conversation, but couldn't quite locate where. "Let me ask you something," Wallace said. He folded his hands on the table. The tremor in his left hand was gone. "When you cleared that building, the one in under 40 seconds, how many of your men went in first?" Brandon blinked. "What? The breach? Who led it?" "I did. I mean, my team. Were you the first man through the door?" "A beat." "Yeah. What did you see in the first 2 seconds?" Brandon opened his mouth, and then he closed it. Not because he didn't remember. He remembered every frame of it. He closed it because something in the old man's question had changed the texture of the conversation in a way he didn't have words for yet. Because the question wasn't asked the way civilians asked questions. It was asked the way someone asks who already knows. "Hallway," Brandon said slowly. "Low light. Door at the end, door to the right, possible X-ray behind the window to the left." Wallace Gidney nodded once. 2 seconds, the old man said. Every time. The first 2 seconds are the ones that count. Everything else is aftermath. He picked up his orange juice. I know what you did in that building, Corporal. I know because I did it too. In buildings that don't have names anymore, in places that aren't on any map your unit uses. I know the weight of those 2 seconds, and I know what a man carries when they go wrong. He set down the glass. Now, you want to tell me again about the men who are specific, and the men who say this and that? The diner had gone quiet without meaning to. The teenage girl with the geometry problem had put her pencil down. The mother with the toddler was looking at her coffee. The man in the county vest nearest to Brandon had leaned slightly back in his seat, the way people do when they want more room between themselves and something. Brandon Kyle Sutter sat very still. He had spent 4 years learning how to read a room, the location of exits, the disposition of potential threats, the weight of silence when it shifts. And the silence that had come into the diner in the last 30 seconds was not nothing. It had texture and temperature, and it was pointing somewhere he hadn't expected to go that Tuesday morning. "What unit?" he asked again. His voice was different now, lower. "That's the question you're leading with," Wallace said. "Yeah." The old man looked at him for a long moment. Not challenging, measuring. "5th Special Forces Group," he said. "Originally. Later they moved me." He turned his orange juice glass in a slow half circle on the table. But that was a long time ago. Brandon felt something reorganize itself quietly in his chest. 5th Special Forces Group was not a punchline. It was not this and that. 5th Group had been, among other things, the first American Special Operations Forces into Afghanistan after September 2001, the unit that coordinated with the Northern Alliance, that moved through terrain most people would not survive, that operated in the kind of ambiguity that no amount of training fully prepares you for. It had a history that extended back to Vietnam, to MACV-SOG, to operations that were classified for decades and that some were still not fully public. "Vietnam?" Brandon asked. "Among other places, SOG?" The old man didn't answer. That was its own answer. Brandon sat back in the booth. The coffee in front of him had gone cool. He didn't reach for it. "I didn't," he started. "You didn't know," Wallace said. "Not generously, not cruelly, just accurately. That's the nature of not knowing. You don't know that you don't know. I was talking out of turn," Brandon said. "You were talking," the old man said. "That's not the same as out of turn. Young men talk. I talked when I was your age." He looked out the window at the parking lot, at the flat October light lying across the asphalt. "I stopped when I saw what happened to the men who kept talking after they should have started listening." Brandon Sutter had a quality, not everyone had it, and it wasn't guaranteed to last, of being able to hear something true and not immediately fight it. He'd had sergeants try to knock it into him, and sergeants try to knock it out of him, and he'd arrived somewhere in the middle, which was closer to honest than most. "What was it like?" he asked. "MACV-SOG? What was it actually like?" Wallace Gidney looked at him for a long moment. "You know what MACV-SOG was?" he asked. "I know what the books say. The books," the old man said, "got about 30% of it." He was quiet for a moment. The waitress had stopped refilling salt shakers. She was standing near the counter with her hands folded, not looking at either of them, but not moving away. "We ran recon across the fence," Wallace said finally, "into Laos, Cambodia, places that officially we were never in. Small teams, 3 Americans, 9 or 10 indigenous personnel, sometimes fewer, no air support you could count on, no cavalry coming if it went wrong. If we made contact, real contact, not a probe and break, the odds were what they were." He stopped. "The first team I ran with," he said, and his voice dropped slightly, not from emotion, or not only from emotion, but from the kind of weight that lives in facts you've carried for 50 years. 6 men. We crossed the fence on a Thursday. By Saturday morning there were 2 of us walking back. The diner was absolutely still. 4 men, Brandon said. 4 men, Wallace repeated. And I knew every one of them. Not the way you know a name on a roster. The way you know a person, their habits, their families, their private jokes. The way you know someone after you've been afraid in the same small space together. Enough times that fear stops being embarrassing. He looked at his hands on the table. That kind of knowing. Brandon did not say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have been a diminishment. "I'm not telling you this to win an argument," Wallace said. "I'm not in the business of arguments anymore." He picked up his newspaper, folded it with the same careful deliberateness he'd used before. "I'm telling you because you asked, and because you seem like a young man who actually wants to know under all the noise," Brandon said. I was making noise, you were, the old man agreed. I do that, most young men do, some of them stop. Wallace tucked the newspaper under his arm. The ones who stop usually become the ones worth sitting with. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. From the wallet he removed a few folded bills and a card, which he set on the table next to his empty orange juice glass. He stood, unhurried, the motion of a man who had learned a long time ago not to move faster than he needed to. He was taller standing than he'd appeared sitting. His jacket, which looked plain and worn and unremarkable, had a small pin on the lapel. It was barely visible, a small dark thing. Brandon had seen enough to know what it was. Combat Infantryman Badge, with a star above it which meant Second Award, meaning Wallace Gidney had served in 2 separate conflicts, sustained enough to earn it twice. Next to it, very small, a pin that Brandon recognized only because he'd done a deep dive on unit history during his first deployment. The shape was unmistakable if you knew what to look for. He knew what to look for. "Sir," Brandon said, and the word came out differently than it usually did. It didn't have the automatic quality of a training habit. It had the quality of a thing meant. Wallace Gidney paused and looked at him. "I was out of line," Brandon said. The old man studied him for a moment with those pale, steady eyes. "You were a young man in a diner with a need to be seen," he said. "That's not a crime. That's just Tuesday." He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. "You've done things worth talking about, I have no doubt about that. But the talking isn't the thing. The thing is the thing, and the thing lives inside you whether you describe it or not." He turned toward the door. "That's not something you can Google. That's not something selection teaches you. That's just time. And you've got more of it in front of you than you know." He walked to the door, pushed it open. The October morning came in for a moment, cool and particular, carrying the smell of exhaust and distant leaves, and then the door swung closed behind him and he was gone. Brandon Kyle Sutter sat in the booth for a long time after. The county workers finished their eggs and left. The mother got the toddler bundled into a jacket and they left. The teenage girl packed up her geometry book and left. The man in the plaid jacket paid his bill and left. The waitress came and refilled Brandon's coffee, even though he hadn't asked. She set it down without comment. She was 20 years old with the patience of someone who had learned it young, and she understood, the way perceptive people sometimes do, that a man needed to sit with something. Brandon reached over and picked up the card Wallace had left on the table. It was plain, no logo, no title. Just a name, Wallace O. Gidney, and a phone number, and below the phone number, in small neat print, the kind of thing a man puts on a card after he's decided the title doesn't matter anymore. "Service is not a story you tell, it's a weight you carry." He turned it over. The back was blank. He set it down. He picked up his coffee. He looked out the window at the parking lot, at the space where an old man in a worn jacket had passed through without anyone noticing. He thought about the first 2 seconds inside a building. He thought about a team of 6 that came back as 2. He thought about a small pin on a lapel that most people in most rooms would never recognize, worn by a man who had never once mentioned it, who had ordered oatmeal and orange juice and read his newspaper and tipped 20%, who had been carrying decades of something in the quiet of that corner booth and had never once felt the need to announce. He thought about noise. He'd come into that diner full of it, chest full of it, voice full of it. The noise of having done something real and needing the world to know, which is a different thing from the thing itself. He understood that now in a way he hadn't an hour ago. Not fully. He'd be working on that understanding for years, probably, adding to it every time the world surprised him with a Wallace Gidney sitting quiet in a corner. But the door was open. He could feel the October air still. He left a good tip. More than usual. Not as a gesture. Just because it felt right. He drove back to his mother's house. He didn't turn the radio on. He hadn't done that in a long time, driven in silence, real silence, without filling it. And he noticed that the town looked a little different through a quiet windshield. Still small, still flat. The same potholed Route 9, the same water tower, the same everything. But he was looking at it differently. And that was something. There is a kind of man who carries everything he has ever done in plain view, worn like a badge, announced like a rank. There is another kind who carries it inward, pressed into the muscle and the bone, so deep that it only shows in the way he sits. Back to the wall, door in his sight line, hands steady when they're moving, trembling only when they're still. The second kind of man is not quiet because he has nothing to say. He is quiet because he understood, somewhere in the long record of his years, that the saying of it was never the point. Wallace Gidney drove home on Tuesday morning and ate a second breakfast at his kitchen table, just toast, and the rest of his coffee from that morning's pot. And he sat in his chair by the window that overlooked the side yard, where a sweet gum tree had been dropping its spiky seed pods onto the grass for 30 years. And he read 3 more pages of his newspaper, and then he set it down and looked out the window for a while, at nothing in particular, at everything. If you had seen him there, you would not have known. You would have seen an old man at a window, quiet, unremarkable, present in the ordinary way of a Tuesday. You would have had no idea. That's the way men like Wallace Gidney prefer it, and that more than any code, more than any operation, more than any building cleared in under 40 seconds, that is the thing that never leaves them. The choice to carry it without a sound, to sit in the corner, to let the room make its noise around them, and to know, without ever having to say so, exactly who they are,